I would like to officially welcome everyone to the next installment of the Leadership at Lunchtime series. We got a lot of good positive response from the first series, and the requests that came in were about how do we talk about what next? What happens after we've led in a crisis and we've successfully moved forward? So I think the following 8 sessions, the next 8 sessions in this Leading in the New Normal, are going to lay the foundation for how we as leaders can be successful in getting through the crisis that we have right now. And as importantly, set our organizations up for success. So we're going to follow a very similar format to what we followed in the first 8 sessions. There's going to be a 15-minute roughly content area where we have an expert or someone that's experienced in the topic speaking and answering questions. But then we move into Q&A session from the audience, from the folks that are participating and listening. And then that person will respond to those questions. In this first series, or in this first session, it's really kind of my privilege to welcome the Executive Director of Leadership and Strategy in the Graduate Executive Education Program, my close friend and colleague, Jonathan Harvey, to come in today. And what we're going to do is basically unpack organizational agility. It's something that we've collectively been working on for a couple years now. And so the two of us will kind of examine and dive into some of the topics in and around how leaders create agile organizations. And so with that, let me welcome Jonathan. Jonathan, welcome to come on to the call.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be back. Thank you for the invitation to come back. It's always nice when you get invited a second time. It suggests the first time wasn't a complete disaster. So thanks for the invite. It's a fascinating topic. It's, I think, a very timely one. It's interesting that several of our speakers in the last series touched on aspects of organizational agility or agile leadership in the focus areas that they were focusing on. And that corresponds to what you and I have seen over the last couple of years with a lot of talk around organizational agility, its importance, the fact that it is believed to provide significant competitive advantage to organizations, but there's a lot of different language, a lot of different terminology, and a lot of different perspectives being taken on it. So I don't know, perhaps we start with, what's your take on agility? What does it mean to you? And maybe we've got some common terms that we can use.
Yeah, thanks. And you're exactly right. Agility is the topic du jour or du annum, is everyone is talking about agility. And I think that one of the things that you and I found out over the last 2 years of investigating this is that there is no real consistency on what we mean. There are various consultancies that have staked positions on it because they see ways of helping organizations do certain things. But we really don't have a strong framework, or we haven't had a strong framework to date. Let me start with the definition that I have for organizational agility. It is the ability of an organization to react to unplanned shifts in their environment, in their workforce, in their market, in the global market space. And that's the first thing, is this react. And that reaction has to be both relatively fast and relatively effective. So, I mean, anybody can react fast by flinching. What we want in an agile organization is the ability to respond positively and quickly to shifts and changes in the environment in which they do the work. The second thing is it's their ability to anticipate some of those shifts, to kind of see what's coming up and to make better projections of where things might happen so they're not caught in an unprepared. And so there's a strategic mindset element. And so that ability to kind of think about and predict is the second part of the definition. And the third part,
because we're not talking about reactive organizations, we're talking about agile organizations.
Exactly. And the first thing is one of reaction, but it's healthy and capable reaction. The second element is one of anticipation. It's the ability to predict. But the third, and this is a really interesting one to me, is the ability to shape the environment. Is the agile organization doesn't just react to things well when they happen, think about things that might be coming true and be good in their guesses. They actually create the conditions for their own success. And that's a really hard thing to do. But that shaping operations, I think, is the third component of this definition that's quite critical to us.
Yeah, we touch on that old military term quite a lot, don't we? That shaping operations. It's those activities and actions that are part of leading the organization, that are setting up conditions for future success. There's always this difficulty of the value of something not being appreciated until you need it. And then it's perhaps too late to bring it about, because I think agile organizations are not something we decide to do on Friday and have on Monday. It's not something that we do by mandate. There's some critical elements that we need to build. And I know there are kind of three that we think about particularly as we've been exploring this whole thing around agility. So maybe that's the next step in the kind of the conversation.
Yeah, let me give an example of shaping, which is, I think we don't typically think about the actions we do today can bring about a future state tomorrow. And I was having a conversation last week with an organization who, of course, got hit like everybody else. Their contracts were drying up. Their customers are saying, we love working with you, but we don't have the cash flow. We don't have the capacity of doing what we're needed. And, they're facing some pretty severe financial hardship. But they have confidence that they're going to come through it when things start releasing and we start seeing a turn, because they've spent the last year completely reinforcing their customer relationships. And it wasn't about the sale of the day. It was about the long-term, mutually beneficial relationship they had with their customers. That's a shaping operation. It's not going out and starting a political action committee or maybe a grassroots movement of shifting attitudes. There can be some of that. But everything we do right now to prepare us for future business is a shaping operation. And it helps us more agilely respond and then almost better predict the things that are coming our way.
So do you think that then falls under that broad category that we talk around insight, around how organizations build insight as a necessary requirement for an agile organization?
Yeah, and so I stomped all over your question a second ago, so let me come back to it. And that insight is a really important component. We've been doing some research looking at kind of the workforce transformation for digitalization, so the digital environment out there. And when we think digital, we are thinking about infrastructure. We're thinking about the dexterity an organization has to shift and move in response or in anticipation of the world. That dexterity is the capability of fast action. The problem with it is if we don't have a good understanding of where we should apply that dexterity, we may be doing the wrong things. And so the very first step is what you just talked about, is not the dexterous capability. The first step is, what's the insight? We have to ask ourselves, what are the questions that we need to answer for what is in front of us and then for a long-term success? And so that insight and dexterity are part of a three-part element of agility. And the last one, as you and I have talked about for a year now, is anybody can change once. I go back to my Army days about air-droppable equipment. All equipment is air-droppable once. You've won if you're able to do that time and time again. And an agile organization is an organization that doesn't just change once. They have a stable core, but they're able to shift and respond and maneuver against the changes in front of them. And they don't generate fatigue, that change fatigue that comes from poorly enacted change. And they don't generate cynicism, which is the underlying parts of that.
Right.
And so I think, let's bring it back to me asking you a question now. So we've got this model, we've got these three things that fit into it. We've talked about how we define it, but how can companies think about creating that agility? What should they do to actually bring about some of those elements in the insight, in the dexterity, and in the resolve functions?
So yeah, I think that's a useful, kicking off point. I think the first part of it is actually making the decision that this is something that you want to bring about. It's a strategic decision to say we need to pivot, establish, organize ourselves in such a way that agility is a key component of what we do. Mm-hmm. And then I think breaking down, as we have done, into these kind of concepts around insight, dexterity, and resolve. If we draw a parallel to kind of broad organizational change initiatives, which we know struggle to succeed, so often part of that struggle is we jump from the setting the conditions and the rationale for change straight into the action when that assumption's not valid. And I think sometimes we can do that with agility as well. And we can move straight into, systems and processes and structures in the organization without establishing that first piece around the insight, which is, where do we gather our intelligence, our knowledge, our perspective on what's happening in and around our industry. Yeah. And without that good and broad base, we're going to struggle. I think undertaking some really effective review of what are the critical roles and functions in our organization, and do we have the right people in those roles and functions? And when we say right people to give us an agile organization. And I think some of that is around strategic thinking. It's around how and where are people networked? How do we integrate our data analytics functions, for want of a better example, into the decision-making process that we have? Do we have that solid basis of insight? Do we understand the mind of the customer? What are we hearing from that? And often these are not high-level C-suite activities. These are activities that are happening deep down within the organization, and that really can challenge some of us in how we connect the dots within the organization. So I think that's probably the first thing.
I think, if we think about the theme of this series, it's about helping leaders more effectively, do what they need and want to do. And so the leader actions and what you're talking about in that insight, first and foremost is being open to communication. So let's think about, yes, the C-suite is looking at the horizon, but they've got the strategy, but what's telling them what's going on the ground? It is the field service technician. It's a customer service representative. It's a local bank manager. These are the folks that have their finger on the pulse of where the organization's work gets done. So how do we, as leaders, how do we create a conduit where that voice is heard, where those become part of our scouts, if you will, that feeds relevant information up to the strategy level of an institution? I worked about 6 years ago with a really clever young business development guy, and he had a very small piece of a multi-billion-dollar business. And he was doing the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act. And he came back to me about 6 months after we were talking about that topic, and he came back and he said, I have got inside the decision cycle of my competitors, and I've done it by taking away their junior engineers. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, so what? He says, those junior engineers were the ones that had all the customer contact. The senior engineers were very arrogant. They didn't do as much talking at the customer level. And they didn't treat the junior engineers very well. So I hired their best and brightest away from them. And with them came the customer relationship. And at that ground level, that had to feed up to the C-suite to say, one of the things we can offer our competitors aren't doing in this space is treating the contact level, the action level better. And so I think that what leaders can do there is make certain they have those right people in the right place, that they're prepared, but then also be accepting of the communications that come in.
Mike, I think that's spot on. I mean, if we think back to 20, 25 years ago in manufacturing organizations, there was this drive to ask the people doing the work how to improve the processes that they were doing. This to me is the kind of the evolution of that idea writ large. And for many organizations, that might be an initiative in and of its own right. not just a component of building an agile organization. But to me, it also speaks to a style of leadership that is comfortable with the leader not necessarily being the expert on everything, not having all of the insight, not having all of the connections, but relying on the people that are working with them to provide that into them. And of course, one of the things we know is that as the higher up the organization we go, the less direct contact we have down into those particular sources of information. And that's obviously a critical component to kicking off the whole concept of an agile organization.
And in fact, some of the lesser successful organizations discount what they're hearing in the field, and the best ones give it high credence. So I'm cognizant of time. Let me do one more quick dive, and then we'll kick it out to Q&As. So we talked a little bit about the insight. I think the dexterity level, the infrastructure, there's a lot of literature available to that. That's where most of it sits. Let's talk about resolve. Let's talk about doing change after change after change, and people are energized by it as opposed to fatigued and become cynical. So yeah. How do we do that? Give us the answers, Jonathan.
Go back to your Machiavelli. Nothing so challenging or as dangerous as to institute a new order of things. We know that change is one of the more challenging aspects of organizational life. It's also one of the reasons that leaders are there. They're there to actually imagine and drive forward a different way of being. It's what someone once explained to me, the difference between leadership and management, that whole kind of long conversation that the management is making sure that we do what we do as efficiently and as well as we can, and leadership was arguing for what we should be doing instead. And I think that resolve piece is around building a culture of individuals who are comfortable with change, who are not threatened by change, who embrace it as the opportunity to go forward. And I think some of us are so vested in what change means for us personally, that building a culture that can set that to the side and say, actually, this is an organization where there isn't a set way of doing things that isn't open to challenge. And I think building that culture as a leader comes from example in the first instance, of not having sacred cows, of not having unquestionable or unchallengeable concepts that you can't engage in, and being driven by the insight.
And that has to be baked into our DNA.
Yeah.
It's the fundamental element of our culture, and it has to be a change-based culture. Exactly. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just reflecting on what so many of us in our organizations have managed to do in the context of change in the last couple of months. That if you'd asked us the month before if we could do them, we'd have lots of reasons why it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
So our capacity for change and our ability to change, I think, is so often so much greater than we believe. And even in our own organization, we can now look and say, look what we managed to do in that space of time because we needed to. We were able to be agile. I think to your point, the question is, can we actually build that as part of our DNA?
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and go to questions from the audience, because I think that's probably the better questions to ask as opposed to you and I tossing questions.
Sure.
Yeah. So Adam and Erica, if you don't mind, let's go ahead and bring in some questions.
Thanks, Mike and Jonathan. So my question is, if a company is constantly changing, doesn't something get lost in terms of value? And shouldn't consistency count for something?
You want me to take that, Jonathan?
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. I think that change, when we talk about agility, it's not that everything is moving. It's not that the entire company just shifts from one thing to the next. There's got to be a core stability, and in the terminology we use, there has to be an intent that's driving everything. That's the stable function of it. So the company may be moving in different ways towards that end state, but the end state doesn't shift as quickly as the activities that will bring it to that end. And so having that core strategic intent, vision, mission that drives the activities allows the workforce and the leaders of that workforce to determine the best path that's in front of them, and then to change that path if a roadblock comes up, if it's not going to get them to where they need to be. The second element of it is I would say that you must consistently dial into your core values. And I'm not talking about what's on a website. I'm talking about those shared beliefs that identify the uniqueness of your institution, that answers the questions, who are we? And as well, who do we want to become? And that should not be as agile and changing, because that's, if you will, it's the core identity of an organization. So yes, it may seem like we're constantly changing if we're not articulating the intent that's driving those shifts, and that we don't have a strong touchstone to the who we are and what does it mean to be us. Jonathan, do you want to add anything to that?
I love the reference to the idea of value, because there's this idea that if we're building an agile organization and we're doing so with insight into our customers, insight into our marketplace, insight into how our business is evolving and changing, you are going to be impacting value. And that is something that the organizations that you work with are going to start seeing as value. So your ability to be agile will be something that will increase the value of the organization, given the caveats and the comments that Mike made previously around what doesn't change in the organization, what remains true. So I think in part it's about how we articulate that into the wider environment around us. But I think value is important as always, but I think it'll change the nature of the value of the organization if you can build in this agile aspect to it.
Let me, yeah, and I want to go back to the part of the question that said, shouldn't consistency count for something? Yes, it absolutely should. But consistency does not mean doing the exact same thing in the exact same way time after time. We have the adage that what gets you here may not get you there. And so where I have seen organizations fail is when they have been wildly successful. And with that success breeds complacency. And with that complacency breeds stagnation. And so the evolution of an organization is absolutely vital to it. The consistency is we are going to constantly grow and change to be more effective, to deliver better value to our stakeholders, to our customers, and to our employees. So I think that consistency is, what are we focused on in consistency? Is it the day-to-day activities, or is it the grander meaning? Thank you.
Is it the product? Is it the product, or is it the systems, processes, insight that resulted in the product that you want to be consistent about? It's the latter in my view.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, Mike, so I have a question for you guys. What are the most difficult things to do in creating an agile organization? I
took the last one first, Jonathan. So let me toss you a hospital pass.
The glib answer I have is it's all difficult, and for two reasons, I guess. One, it's not quick, and two, it's never finished. You're constantly kind of engaged and reviewing, and I think particularly in successful organizations, and Mike just touched on it, you're almost at risk of being seen as a naysayer and saying, we need to shift and pivot, when actually we have things that are working really, really well. And there's nothing so challenging as arguing for a different way of engaging when the way that we're currently engaging is working really well. So I think that's one of the most difficult things. And then the other is that you may not have the span of discretion for the entire organization. You've got your bit of it. So how do I start applying some of these principles in my bit of the organization that's going to demonstrate value back, that creates momentum? Go back to your core change principles that you apply in other aspects of what you do. Mike, what's your take?
Yeah, I think if I was going to think about the most difficult thing is overcoming fear. Because fear is perhaps one of the biggest inhibitors of our ability to be agile. We know it, as you just said, we know what's in front of us. We know what works generally for this. We don't know that if we try something new or a different approach, it's going to be successful. So there's the fear of failure. If we are agilely responding to shifts in a marketplace, some folks in our organization may lose power and influence and others may gain it. If we move from a product-based manufacturing organization to a service-based organization, Well, we have just shifted the power and influence that people have inside the institution. So fear of loss of status and loss of impact and influence. And then the third is just the fear of the unknown. And so the difficulty here is born in the attitudes of people through that process. And I think there's some ways that we should think about this. So if that difficulty in creating the Agile organization is people buying into it and then being able to be part of that, we have to shift their attitudes. And there are kind of 4 things we do to work through attitudes. The first of which, we have to generate the awareness of why it's important. So that awareness of a change is coming. The worst thing in the world is a CEO coming in on Monday morning and the good idea fairy visited him over the weekend. And now everything is, well, we're no longer making hula hoops. We're now making handguards for M16s. That might be a wise business choice, but you've got to be able to build the awareness within your people as to why to do it. The second is interest. We have to say, what's in it for me? What's in it for us? And the interest is a very necessary phase to get them to try it out, to kind of look at the new processes, the new ways. And then finally, we get up to adoption. And in adoption, we've got kind of 3 elements of that. We've got, yeah, I'll comply. It's a form of adoption. But in honesty, when it doesn't work, I'm going to quit. Yeah, I'll do it because I trust and respect you as a leader. I'm going to do it because it's the right thing to do. And we constantly have to be working on the attitude shift towards the agile responsiveness of the organization. So yeah, that's my psychologist to me talking.
I would follow that up with the reflection for the individual leader is that it's going to require different things of you. And I think it requires a broadening of, what Mike and I will talk about of a behavioral repertoire of a leader. Their influence skills, their different ways of getting things done. And it's going to cause you to challenge some of the things that have made you successful to date. And I think that's one of the other challenges in all of this. It's not just about asking others to shift their perspective and their beliefs and their values around how things are done. It requires me to shift my own as well.
Yeah.
So the next question is, agility in the context of reasonably small to medium-sized organizations seems much more achievable than for large organizations. How do you deal with scale?
So if I were to think about it, it may be more apparent in smaller to medium organizations that they're shifting and responding. Larger organizations that have wide diversification of either portfolio or product offering or functionality, not all of those folks need to be shifting and changing to every activity in the outside world. It's only relevant to the piece of the world that is addressed, is addressing that function. So if it's a shift in consumer buying behavior, then it's your marketing folks and your manufacturing folks. They're going to have to change what they're doing. Your general counsel and legal staff, your finance, they probably don't have to change as much. If it's a shift in regulatory environment, then you're going to see it. In smaller organizations, people wear multiple hats. And so it looks like it's impacting across the whole organization, only because we don't have as much role differentiation. I think the other element of this is there are parts of our institutions that are more resistant to change than others. And one of the things we found in agility is that, HR departments, legal departments, finance, these are institutions that don't change as quickly as the other parts. A lot of it because they're bound by regulatory requirements or, fiduciary requirements or even legal requirements. And other parts is it's really hard to change those big, massive types of systems. So I don't think actually that we see a massive scaling issue. It's just that it's broken out when we get to the bigger institutions of the piece of the organization that's being agile and responsive.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Mike. I think you raise a really interesting point around those disciplines within the organization that are maybe harder to shift. And I think one of the reasons for that is that they're perhaps more removed from the kind of the nitty gritty of doing things on the shop floor of the organization. I think one of the really interesting ideas around agility is how you drive some of those functions down into the organization. So, I mean, for a number of years now, we've talked about the shift towards the HR business partner who's kind of nested down in parts of the organization and is very much, you know, at the coalface of what's going on. How do we do that with those other parts of the organization that are going to help do that? But I think, you know, to the question, much of the difference between the smaller and medium-sized organizations and the larger ones is a perceptual one, I think, in terms of how you do this. I think the resources and the dedicated functionality that larger organizations can bring can actually make them, you know, a little more effective at this in the short term.
Okay. I've got a text from Eric and Adam. We've got some questions left, but we're right at the half-hour mark. And so if you all need to sign off, please feel free. You can come back and watch the recording to get to the other questions. We're going to drive through just so we can answer all the questions you've put to us. So thank you. So go ahead and let's go on with the next questions.
Okay, so the next question, is there a risk that seeking agility and the consequent state of change just results in a strategic muddle and lack of alignment?
That's a really good question. I think I think it depends how good your strategy is, because a good strategy tells you as much about what you don't do as what you do. And I think given that, you know, you have those parameters that help guide what you're seeking to be agile in and the focus of that agility. And the state of change is well, you know, that is a given almost these days around, you know, the cadence and the tempo of change. But I think it's about managing that process rather than just responding and reacting to it.
Yeah, so I think of kind of the tenets of strategic thinking, not strategic planning. And the first element of strategic thinking is being intent driven. That's your stability. And so you're not muddling through. What may happen is that we don't communicate our intent as clearly as we should. It does not resonate through the entire organization. So it looks like we are kind of knee-jerking to things. And so I think that being intent-driven is quite important. The second thing is that we have to use planning assumptions, and our folks need to understand we don't have perfect understanding of the world. And those planning assumptions, when they prove false or when they prove true, are going to shift our posture. That doesn't mean that we haven't thought about it. It means that we're validating the things that underlie what we're trying to do. And the third thing is that we actually have to cherish opportunism. We need to be able to move away. Don't stick to a 1,200-pound manifesto, 1,200-page manifesto of our strategic plan when the world says, hey, if you did this, I don't know, if you combine an internet search device, a telephone, and a media device, you're going to change the world, which is, Steve Jobs, 2007. So I think that, we don't muddle along. We have to communicate what we're doing, and we go back to Simon Sinek's talk on why. They need to know, our folks need to know why we're doing what we're doing, and then kind of where we're going.
So the next question is, all this seems really top down. How do we as leaders act agile when our companies may not be very flexible?
Yeah, I'll take the shot at that one, because perhaps some of the most common frustrations when I deal with leaders, even at the executive level, is when the organization doesn't seem to be moving as fast or in the right direction as they would like it to do. And that's always a challenge. I think that we have to give the C-suite the opportunity to make their decisions. They have the responsibility for guiding the strategy of the organization, but it doesn't mean that we cannot clean up with the processes and the activities and the mindsets of the folks that we're responsible in our area of operations. And by being more agile internally, we can actually perhaps present more options, more courses of actions, available courses of actions to the strategic planning process. It can be very frustrating if you are attempting to respond to market conditions in a timely fashion and your financial regulations don't allow you to spend what you need to, or your hiring is restricted to get the right people in to kind of go back to that touch point for building insight. That can be very, very frustrating, and we've got to work through it. the guidance that I would give is you work in the organization that you choose, and you can make it a better organization. If you're frustrated with the folks above you, you owe it to have a candid conversation with them, to talk about that, not to be silent, and not to point out things that you want to do to improve on it. And I go back to Scott Brower when he was with us talking about decision making under fire, and his point about having candid upwards facing conversations is absolutely relevant here as well. So be careful of the frustration, take care, hoe your own garden, take care of your folks in your area of responsibility, and then upwards influence as best you can, realizing you don't have nearly as many tools going up as you do doing down and going sideways. Jonathan, what did I miss?
No, I think that was a good cover. What I would say is this: building agile organizations cannot be a solely top-down exercise, and therefore, if it's starting to look like that, that would be a warning sign to me that we're maybe not being as effective as we need to be. So I think you've got to engage the people within your organization at the level of which things get done, because without that, this is not going to work.
Okay.
Okay, guys, my next question: how have you helped great managers that are process and quality focused grow in agility as it pertains to PFMEA and controls plans? Redundancy versus flexibility is something that is challenging based on personality types. Advice to make that easier to leaders of those managers.
I'll let you take that one, Mike.
Okay. Yeah. I think that, we are talking fundamentally a divide on one of the big 5 factors of personality, and that's openness to change and new experience. And folks that sit high on that look for the next new shiny thing. Folks that sit low on that tend to defend and preserve the value that we have. And we have to realize that both of those personality types are advantageous and disadvantageous depending on the circumstance. How do we help folks that are process focused, that spend a lot of time getting the workflow processes, the project management plan together? How do we help them understand the value of agility? Is to have them do scenario planning, to think about under what conditions is this process that we have in place, this project plan that we have in place, under what conditions will it fail? Under what conditions will it return less than optimal results? And can we tweak and manage that system or that approach in a way that meaningfully changes the outcome for the better? We're not saying start over. Agile doesn't mean do it completely different. It means flexing and doing the things necessary to become more effective and more productive. And to the point of folks that love that kind of, it came off the mountain in stone tablets, and there are 10 project things we're going to do for now and forever. Form a support group in the organization with other folks like that and say, hi, my name is Mike Grogine and I'm a control freak. You want to make certain that folks see the value in being agile, and not just for agility's sake or change's sake. They see the value because it adds both commercial brand value as well as quality of life value to the employees. So I think that we've got to make that kind of connection for them.
Yeah, I think that's good, Mike. And I think it's important to remember that even in an agile organization, there are going to be those core things that we have to pay attention to, that we have to be consistent on, that we have to get right, and having people who have that perspective on process, routine, the discipline of being able to do that without wanting to introduce a new way of doing everything in every opportunity is a vital part of what we do, and therefore there is a role there, and it will balance the more driven individuals finding the new, the shiny, and the different, when in fact that may not be what agility is driving.
Thanks, guys. We've got one final question. Could you compare and contrast change management and agility? What is the distinction? Is one a part of the other?
Jonathan, you want me to take first shot?
Go.
Okay. I think when we talk about change management, we are talking about enterprise-wide significant shifts. You know, these are tectonic plates moving for the most part when we talk about big change management. We go to John Cotter's work on kind of the way that we change organizations, you know, establish a sense of urgency, you know, build your change team. Those are very often massive endeavors. That may be when we're doing a complete and total strategy revision. So we are moving from a manufacturing product oriented to a service line. That requires a very deliberate, almost organization-wide effort. And those activities, if you don't get them right, you're not going to get the full buy-in. By way of example, was working with a company a few years ago who basically did constructions and then refits. So, and it was seasonal. So it was, you know, basically summer and winter, people preparing for those. And what they realized is that they had this roller coaster of revenue, and they were having to kind of furlough people in the periods in between. So they laid a service offering in there that was worth the value of about 50% of their revenue on year. But it fundamentally changed. It was a mind shift. They had to change their perspective quite dramatically to be able to lay out that third prong of their strategy. And that was a deliberate change. They don't do that every year. They don't do that every month. They don't do that every 10 years. Agile organizations understand who they are and where they're going, and they adjust to get the path right to get there. And it doesn't, you know, very rarely is represented by an organizational-wide shift. It's the reapplication of energy, the reprioritization of focal points. And it may be some moving of people around, but agility is all about kind of how do we get to the 3 to 5 year intent that we've established and be able to maneuver on the path to get there, as opposed to changing where the goal is.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is I think a change-based culture is a necessary aspect of the resolve component of an agile organization. And therefore, I think there's a difference between a big change program and a change orientation or culture within the organization. And I think without that resolve piece, that ability to keep doing this, that ability to kind of come at it without fatigue or cynicism, requires a change orientation, change mindset in terms of the culture of the organization. And I think that sometimes that's where the confusion can come in.
So we are, thank you all for your questions. We are going to continue this series for 7 more sessions. We'll do it similar to the way we did the first 8 sessions. We'll bring in external experts. We'll bring in, you know, executive leaders from across industries to kind of address some points of how do we lead in the new normal? How should we change what we're doing? I think the value for us to consider as kind of a takeaway thought is, if anything, the economic crisis, the pandemic, has caused us to completely reevaluate what we hold precious and dear. And that may be that we put everything on the table in our institutions and say, how do we go from here? Where do we work better? How do we actually do things differently? There's a honeymoon period for when crises end, for when we can actually institute true shift. And we have to be prepared in this leading in the new normal to create the conditions for success in the new normal. Jonathan, any final thoughts from you on kind of, you know, what you would give as advice and guidance to the folks that are listening?
Tune in for the next episode would be the first one. I find these personally really, really useful, very helpful. I've enjoyed the dialogue on all of them. And, you know, Mike, I just want to say, you know, great job to the team for putting this together. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to seeing where the next ones go.
Absolutely. I'm going to go back to what Brian Bonomo, one of our previous guests, said. You know, that, you know, leader growth is not born in experience. It reflects, you know, it arises from the reflection on that experience. This
Yeah.
is intended as a reflection point. That's how we started. That's how we're going to keep going on. So thank you all very much. Jonathan, thank you so much for your time of your day and your insights. And we will see you all next week, Wednesday. And if not, please feel free to watch the recordings as we post them. So thank you all very much. Have a safe and healthy week.